Super excited to be in this very accomplished group of people. We're going to have a very deep discussion with a lot of different opinions, so I'm super excited to kick off the day with this. Just putting a bit of context, I think carbon markets have been obviously on the topic, whether in a good way, in a bad way. There's a lot of different opinions floating around the market, but there's certainly one that this is, some people define an asset class, some people define a category that is there to stay and about to scale. However, some people also reflect that this has been around for quite some time. Compliance markets has been around in different format, in different geographies for numerous of years, and voluntary carbon markets, again, have a word voluntary in it. Therefore, they're just emerging. When we look at the stack of how carbon markets behave, we at Contrarian like to call it an infrastructure stack. And I like to compare carbon markets to somewhat simple approximation of how fintech looked like when it got disrupted, how, let's say, some people call crypto, how it got disrupted, because we had numerous different tokens, they had different value, how you can reflect to how carbon markets looks from a different carbon credit perspective. But there was one clear path. The transactional infrastructure layer was the most important one, where people go and transact in this market and how they do it. So I would like to kick off this discussion about how do you describe the current state of VCM? The market has been somewhat growing over the last couple of years. There was a lot of hype that happened in 2020, and we're in this very interesting point of time where there's a lot of innovation coming to the sector, yet the market itself as VCM from a trading volume perspective is a bit in a flux of deciding which direction it goes. Starting with you, William, what do you think is the current state of the voluntary carbon markets at the moment?
Well, once again, thank you for the invite. I'm very happy to be in Warsaw for the first time. Beautiful city. What is the current state? I mean, it's sometimes when I get on stage and I describe the carbon markets, I sort of draw a parallel with the dog's breakfast. It's very messy, right? There are a lot of different registries, there are a lot of different methodologies, different types of projects, a million opinions, and we're just trying to sort of get into the groove. There's one characteristic of the carbon markets that really is at the center of all of this confusion, and it's really the word voluntary, right? Today, the ultimate buyer of carbon credits is a sustainability officer at a corporate using a marketing budget. And because of that, every time they buy carbon, there is reputational risk attached to it, right? So it's very difficult to unlock a lot of the things that we traditionally see in the carbon markets, in traditional commodities, right? Because the ultimate buyer can't just go in and say, oh, okay, there's a contract on ICE, there's a contract on ACX, I'll just buy that contract, I'm done. That can't happen yet. And there's a lot of things that we're working on in order to get to that stage. There's this ICVCM, which is the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets, that are trying to set some standards. But I think that the main thing that's happening is that a lot of tax regimes are popping up around the world, a lot of emission trading schemes are popping up around the world. And what that will do is governments will then delineate these carbon credits are eligible for payment in my carbon tax regime. At that point, it stops being voluntary and it becomes compliant. And so we are at that inflection point. How quickly we're going to move, I think it's just around the corner because we see these happening in Singapore, we see them in South Africa, we see them in Colombia. India, Brazil is talking about it, So it's all over the place. So we're at the cusp of moving into a really interesting commoditized time in the carbon markets.
Thomas, you're part of one of the largest exchanges. Nasdaq has been around trading probably every other security or commodity less so probably. You've seen novel markets evolve through the last 20 years in financial sector. How do you as a firm think about the market? You have done some things in the market. You acquired Pure Earth, which is in biochar. How do you see the market from outside when you go internally?
First, I can just copy Bill's first comment. Thank you for having me, and first time in Warsaw, fantastic city. In terms of the market evolving, I think it's, whether it's a dog's breakfast, I don't know, but it is very fragmented, and it's very non-commoditized as it is right now. It's so many different types of credits, etc., which makes it very difficult. Hopefully we will solve that over time. We have, from a Nasdaq perspective, yes, we acquired or made a majority investment in Pure Earth, which is a standard and the registry standard for solely carbon removals, industrial-based carbon removals. And I can come back to that later on why we opted for that one. But I think one key element which Bill touched upon, but it's that it's so many different views. It's so many different views what to use the credits for. You have the one end of the spectrum which thinks don't touch carbon credits, only abatements. And then you have the other sector or the other end, which we need to scale it. It should be just commoditized and used as quickly as possible. And then you probably have something in the middle, also differentiating between the more permanent CDRs versus the more traditional offsets. And I think what could unlock the market and what is needed, it's not only the quality and the integrity of the credit, but also from the claim side, from the use side. And that is to be clear with target setting on the abatements, priority number one, and you follow that, monitor that, report on that. Over time, I liked your first statement here with the pathway. I think a pathway, a credible pathway to net zero is key for corporates. They can't just look backwards. They have to start to look forward and to build a portfolio of permanent CDRs, carbon removals, because that is what the real climate effect on a durable way. And then lastly, you have the more traditional offset, which is good as well. They have a lot of different co-benefits, social benefits, biodiversity benefits, etc. And that they should be used for what it is, so to say. And then if you could set individual targets for this, you could defuse the whole debate whether you should be on this side or that side. I think that would be key to be able to scale the market and get the credibility and trust into the market.
Gordon, we share an investment in Aircarbon. You definitely have an eye for that market. ICE is obviously a huge player in a lot of markets. What's your perspective on where we are with this market currently?
Yeah, so I think I love the pathway, and maybe before diving into the detail of carbon markets, it'd be good to tell the ICE pathway, because I was lucky enough to get here early yesterday and so saw the pictures. And I don't know how many people in the room know who Jeff Sprecher is, or even ICE, but you've probably all heard of the New York Stock Exchange. And I sort of imagine that, 25 years ago, Jeff could have been up here pitching his business, because Jeff bought a company in 1997 for $1. He created ICE in 2000. He listed it on the New York Stock Exchange in 2005, and he bought it in 2012. So I almost think that I'm literally sitting here representing ICE, but I'm sort of standing on the shoulders of a giant in energy and climate tech. He's one of the original entrepreneurs, and I'd say ICE has still got that entrepreneurial spirit at heart. We're almost it's an umbrella organization for a bunch of startups. So Jeff's vision was to really digitize energy and environmental markets, and again, he did that 20 years ago. So when you describe the camp of, we definitely sit in the camp that the environmental markets are not new. I agree with some of the comments on VCM. I do. It's a bit of a pet hate of mine to call anything voluntary that you're trying to create a market in. But the challenge is the demand side, and the way that the carbon credit market or the VCM is treated, it's treated as a discretionary good. Whereas if you are a covered entity under a cap and trade program, you need to buy the permit. You need to buy the carbon allowance. If you don't buy the carbon allowance and you're in the EU ETS, you get fined and you still need to buy the carbon allowance. So you effectively have to buy the permit to stay in business. Now, my title is Managing Director of Utility Markets. What does that mean? It's really the origins of utility markets is the economics of electricity generation. And so in Europe, we know that electricity generators have to pay for every ton that they emit. So I've had a front row seat on really the part of the sector that has been the most successful in decarbonization. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the sector that has to pay for their pollution have decarbonized the quickest. And so we need to be able to change the dynamic of companies that are not covered under government mandates to treat their emissions as liabilities and pay for them. And there's a lot of own goals in the VCM. Various organizations get into this hierarchy around, oh, you need to abate first, and like credits is like the last thing you do. But actually, an electricity generator is compensating for its liability. And that, by putting that negative externality cost through your business, you're incentivized to go find cheaper abatement. So actually, the first thing you should do is compensate. And one of the tools to compensate is a carbon credit. So carbon credits need to be used like carbon allowances.
Thanks, Gordon. So, as you mentioned, this is a very good pathway to the next question. When we think about this market, a lot of people approach it differently. So some people think it's a new market. Some people think it's a market just evolving, right? As we go that pathway for that market to scale. Because eventually, if it doesn't scale, I think for a lot of people and financial investors especially, is going to be a tricky one. You come from obviously a bit different background because that's one part of your business. William, you've built businesses before in multiple areas that were regulated, and those were the areas where sometimes you're the first one to go in that market and to actually build that market from scratch. Whether people like it or not, the voluntary carbon market, I think still the corporations voluntarily now are trying to figure out a way for them to, offset, because they understand that the pathway to decarbonize actually the industries that there are sometimes takes time to build infrastructure, to have necessary technologies to be able to scale to the levels that address their business through scope 1 to 3. You as an entrepreneur, you go to this market and you have some heavyweights. Expansion has been around for some time, backed by big investors such as Blackstone, Goldman's. You have Temasek trying to carve out their own pathway to become, for Singapore now, not New York, to become probably the market where they believe the trade could happen. How did you approach this journey? You've been in this market, you have a vast amount of knowledge and experience. I remember just 2 years ago, we were speaking in the Zero's internal conference and told me the whole story. How do you approach? What do you think is missing? Regulatory push, more knowledge and education? And are you, for example, willing to do that education for some of these clients that would come to transact with you?
Well, I think that one of the main problems with the market is that it's not that we need to bring traditional commodities architecture to the carbon markets. Right, and that was sort of our North Star in terms of setting up the company. We looked at the market, as I said, a bit of a dog's breakfast, and really what it needs is a very strong and reliable price signal. And the only way you get that is if you have a traditional commodities architecture. And so that's what sort of fueled the idea of the company, and that's what brought us to where we are today. We've gone we chose a pathway, to use your analogy, we chose a pathway that was extremely difficult, right? We're fully regulated. We have a fully regulated clearinghouse. Those are not cheap infrastructures to build, right? But we're guided by this principle of bringing traditional commodities architecture. So if you if you look at any commodity, right? So soybeans is a good example that I always use. Farmers in the spring, they assume they plant in the spring, they plant, and they do so with a lot of confidence, right? Because there are instruments there that can hedge. They can hedge their future exposure to. The seedlings are financed by banks, which do so willingly because they have a clear price signal on an exchange that basically says, I can hedge my exposure there. There are weather derivatives. There's all kinds of stuff that they can rely on. Financial markets are extremely, extremely robust, and they allow for capital to be deployed very quickly because you can fragment risk very, very easily. None of that existed in the carbon markets, right? Zero. So if you are a project developer and you are trying to create carbon credits from a forestry project or through Puro using one of their methodologies, using some removals, you're actually an entrepreneur, right? You're taking significant risk. You're taking a view that the carbon credits that you are going to generate will make you a lot of money. And in fact, it actually does. I'll give you an example that, cook stove projects, which generate carbon credits, actually cost about $1 to $1.20 to make, right? So the full investment into a cook stove deployment project will generate carbon credits for you at about $1.20. And those carbon credits today probably sell somewhere between $5 to $8 a ton, right? So that's a significant return, but there are no real price signals in fully regulated exchanges that are backing you, right? So you're really in the far west of investing money. But that was really our guiding principle. Let's just bring traditional commodities architecture, and I think that will make a big difference.
You, Thomas and Gordon, you have big organizations behind you. There's a credibility and reputation issue behind it. And where I'm going with this is, if you put something on your platforms to be traded eventually, you take responsibility of clients who go transact there. Well, we look at oil markets, we look at gas markets, we look at any other commodity that's widely traded, we sort of know who the counterparty is. The supply chain before the contract goes on your exchange to trade is a pretty defined scope. You have traders like Mercuria, Glencore, Vitol, or established organization with credit lines. They can settle, they can pay. We're going in a novel market where it's hard to define quality. It's hard to define the transparency of the contract. The price discovery is somewhat non-existent, and there's a counterparty risk from a developer's side, which is sometimes unknown. How do you view that part of that? And there's an MRV, which is probably one of the most important parts of it, right? Which is still, there's not a lot of data. We have it, but it's not standardized to a level where someone can feel confident to be trusted. How do you feel about having institutions such as Nasdaq and eyes behind you and looking at these different projects and onboarding them? How does your logic go evolve, and where do you think we are? We're 5% of where you would like to see? We're 20%, 50%? How do you view this, and what type of risks you underwrite when you would get those contracts behind your name? Either of you.
Well, there's a lot in there.
Do you have time?
Yeah, well, so the carbon credit market, it's not a financial market yet. It's at best, it's maybe a supermarket. So that standardization hasn't really come yet. And the sort of normal life cycle of an exchange is that you kind of mop up after everyone's done the hard work of doing the standardization, and because of our network, one-to-many model, you sign up with a clearing bank and you've got access to hundreds, if not thousands, of customers. We don't really have the benefit of waiting to do this for an energy transition, whether it's developing new carbon markets or whether it's developing new energies. It could be hydrogen, ammonia, whatever. So we're trying to get more involved in the beginning. We know what the foundations of a good benchmark futures contract is, and can we use that experience to sort of fast track fast track it rather than just waiting on other people to do it. I mean, and Bill has said this, there are very few benchmark futures contracts. What do they do, and what do financial markets do? Financial markets is about allocating capital and managing risk. If you can manage risk, you can raise more capital. You know, companies are accessing exchanges like ICE to smooth their earnings, right? And if you smooth your earnings, you can access more forms of capital and cheaper forms of capital. You can optimize your inventory, and developers don't have that opportunity at the moment because there isn't a sort of a benchmark futures contract for carbon credits, which really represent a carbon saving. You know, the difference between a carbon allowance and a carbon credit is that the carbon allowance is issued by the government. It represents a ton. You don't measure it. It's just related to the cap, the amount of emissions that you can send into the atmosphere. The MRVs on the demand side, i.e., as an emitter, you need to calculate your emissions and go buy an allowance. Carbon credit represents a carbon savings. It's either a ton of reduction or removal. So you got to MRV the demand and the supply in a carbon credit market. You know, you get into the demand side of scope 1s, 2s, and 3s, and if you come from an allowance market, which is polluter pay, that's just scope 1. So when you start getting into scope 2s and 3s, you kind of go, that's just weird. And you're getting into double, triple counting, and I'm an accountant, and when double, triple counting, I sort of short circuit my brain. The trick on the supply side is whether people believe that the ton is a real ton of reduction or removal. And so we need to get to a stage where people sort of have trust in the MRV of the supply. Like, no one ever questions that a renewable energy credit represents 1 megawatt hour of electricity, yet probably very few people in the room know how it works, right? You just go, it's metered in, it's there, but there's very little trust in whether a ton represents a carbon saving on the supply side. So that's the challenging aspect. We are trying to get involved in the primary market, you know, just like NYSE IPO. We're trying to bring developers straight to market, allowing buyers to interact directly with effectively the issuer. So rather than sitting on the sidelines reading a negative article, come see for yourself. And that pre-auction roadshow is actually really important in terms of the point that you made, education. It's not well known what carbon markets do. I mean, ultimately, these are economic tools that are promoting positive environmental outcomes. They're basically managing the ultimate scarce resource, which is the atmosphere.
Any takes, Thomas, on this topic?
Yeah. I think we have, from a Nasdaq perspective, we have taken a slightly different position and a different role compared to both ACX and ICE. We entered into the voluntary carbon market and probably with the view that, okay, of course, Nasdaq, we should also provide the marketplace. After digesting this, we have opted for another role. The reason for that is when we went into the voluntary carbon market, what we wanted to do is that we want to serve our listed corporates. We have the 6,000 listed corporates globally. We have another 4,000 or 5,000 corporate clients, and we want to serve them not in their ESG journey. Everything from advice to workflow tools to reporting, etc., but also to manage their residual emissions. And to put, as you asked, to put the Nasdaq name behind something, there has been, as we have discussed, integrity questions about the voluntary carbon market. We found the Pure Earth with the focus on the CDRs, the removals, the industrial-based, which we see is another type of permanence in the removals and the storage. And also, since it's removals and industrial-based, it's much easier with the MRV. So the integrity per se is easier, at least. And thereby we feel comfortable to put the Nasdaq name behind that. And our focus is to scale that part of the market. to scale that from bringing on the suppliers, have a registry, a credible scientific board that reviews all the methodologies, etc., and bring it to the market and work through different distribution channels. So that's how we have gone about. Once again, I think it would be so beneficial to see the different types of credits for what it is. And there are absolutely a lot of benefits with the more traditional ones, and you have biodiversity, social aspects, and these kind of factors as well. So I think all these measures and actions have very good merit with the abatements, with the building up the permanent long-term and net zero path portfolio of CDRs, the removals, and also to do compensation in terms of other types of credits.
So I use the narrative pathway. I think we sort of covered a bit what sort of has been going on till up to date to today. I think there's some interest for me, haven't had you here now on stage to contemplate a bit of where we're going to go. Before we do that, maybe one comment that I kind of felt, we've been looking at the space since 2019 as a VC firm. We backed a company called Choose that changed their business model a few times as well as they went about. When we did a mapping at that time, there were probably 4 companies. I saw per-earth mapping, now there's 250 companies working in this space. Where I'm going with that is not about the technology that are being built, it's about more, we actually, as part of discussions yesterday, we had one point taken about one of the people that was speaking. When you're going to a new market, and you're the new entrant in the market, there's a huge reputation for you to do the right thing for the market. And what I mean by that is, like, when you go to educate people, you can say different things and people will take those things with them, and that will be their reality of the market, let's say in the VCM context. What we've seen as a firm, there's so many new entrants that are just jumping on it and preaching their own story, which is completely sometimes irrelevant to where the market would eventually evolve. There's all these novel technology companies which don't feel like technology companies. It's just like people trying to set up B2C businesses and all these marketplaces that don't even make sense in the construct of how people will transact in this market. I think we looked at probably over the last 12 months or at like 40 different marketplaces that people are saying they will secure the demand, there's gonna be proprietors, it's like the whole story again and again. You have seen this market from different angles. What could be the biggest misconception or failure of this huge flux of technology entrepreneurs going into this market and carving their own perception and preaching it to corporates? Do you feel, because you interact with clients, that some of them are completely lost in this game and that's why they abandon the market? What could be the risks associated with that huge interest in the sector? I mean, I was just curious because you definitely get to see a lot of companies that get to pitch you as well. You get to see a lot of clients that probably come to transact and eventually say, like, I don't even know how to approach this market. Do you think is there a risk today that this market is a bit overheated and we're just like, you know, Bill Gates says, we overestimate 3 years, but we underestimate 10, and it feels like we're a year 2 or 3 of overestimating what this market could be. Any of you?
Yeah, so, I mean, you need to be careful. I mean, net zero is so complex that there's no such a thing as an expert, you know, because you need to be a scientist, an economist, an engineer, you know, so you have to have a certain degree of humility that you don't know the answers. It's very challenging to the points that you make. There's so much noise in this market. And everyone suddenly wants to be an environmental marketplace or is trying to get into the carbon game. And I think that's, and this is a good thing, by the way, that some of that's the Carney effect, because in the lead up to COP26, the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets was set up. And I think if the former governor of the Bank of England is going around talking about these markets, everyone's going, whoa, you know, what is this? But like you, we see lots of things coming across our path. I think ICE has changed its sort of M&A strategy over the last few years around energy transition and net zero, because you don't really know what the answer is going to be. So where in the past ICE tend to buy big things or all of things, you know, so like $10 billion in mortgage technology. And this time we're doing some more strategic investments like a B0, because we don't really know what the outcome is. Now, we're sort of confident in our own business, but we're also paranoid. And although Jeff was the original disruptor, we can be disrupted as well. So we've made some strategic investments, but I do think there's a lot of noise and there is a bubble out there. Yeah, so I think you have to focus on, if you've got your own plan, it's very easy to be distracted by the noise. So you've got to sort of, if you're comfortable with the plan, you need to execute on it. You have to be aware of what's going outside, but don't focus too much on the outside, because you'd never get anything done.
I think one thing to keep in mind, I'm paraphrasing here, but Larry Fink, who runs BlackRock, sends out a letter to CEOs on an annual basis. This is about two or 3 years back. He basically said, if you're sitting on a board and you're not looking at climate change as a risk, you're being negligent, right? So I think that, and I honestly believe that. So you really need to look at the market, and that is the reason why I believe there's just so much attention. And like everything else, the cream eventually rises to the top, right? And so, I don't so much envy your position where you look at so many things. I'm sitting on in my cockpit, sort of just very much focused on delivering our strategy. It's a lot of these companies that are coming up thinking that it's a very good idea. Like, for example, in my space, which is spot trading, right? So not like the big guys. I loved your thing about that usually people sort of clean and mop up before you guys come in, and so I had this vision of me with an apron, just sort of sort of cleaning up the marketplace so that you guys could then come and have fun on it. But I think that one thing that these marketplaces that we compete with, they're popping up all over the place, they don't understand, is we've been at this now for 5 years, right? We have 280 companies fully KYC'd, AML'd, and onboarded. That is a huge barrier to entry, right? I recently met someone in a London conference 2 days ago, and they said, yeah, we're doing this exchange, and it's going to be a great place for corporates to buy and sell and all this other stuff. And I'm like, it took us about 1.5 years to onboard Shell, right? Because you go in there and you have to convince them. First, you have to convince one individual that it's a good idea for them to add on to your exchange to their already, ICE, Nasdaq, and all the other things that they have. And then once you do that, that individual, it's really a thankless job, because then that individual has to move a company of the size of Shell to onboard. So then you have compliance, you have the technology people that come and kick tires on your technology. Wait a minute, you're going to connect to our systems? Okay. That is a massive, massive lift, right? And so a lot of the companies that sort of pop up and they have this idea, many times, and I can't tell you that when I started, I knew this, but it's been 5 years now, and it's a very tough road, right? And it's a huge investment that to date hasn't paid off, right? So when I sit with my investors, I tell them, look, what we're doing is we're building all the plumbing, right? And so when the carbon credits start flowing, we'll have the plumbing in place. But it's interesting. But if you just look at the McKinsey numbers and you listen to Larry Fink, it makes sense why there are so many startups and so many people are just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing if it sticks.
Any particular view, Tomas? What is the noise? When you first sat at the table, you obviously made a decision, again, to go to this market, as you mentioned, with Puro. And what was the discussion at that point? Like, there was a lot of, again, noise, but you've been tracking this market for sure. So, how did you view this?
I think it's, is it a bubble? Okay, it's probably very many players in the market. We saw this map, and I hope and I think it won't look the same in 3-5 years' time.
Does that mean consolidation?
Yeah, absolutely. It needs to consolidate and be in order to create a more efficient structure. Will it be very streamlined like the financial market? It's probably going to take many years. I think it's going to be a number of different models that is needed. It's going to be the spot market is needed. Hopefully we can build a liquid future market which is needed as well. I think for many of these like big projects, etc., there's a need for these like long off-take agreements. It's more like to a certain extent like a corporate bond market. You can compare it to that. It's an individual project that you have to build the book and in order to issue. And that's going to stay for quite some time as well, I think, in order to get the security in terms of the revenues for the project and get it bankable. So I think that you're going to have these different models in parallel for quite a long time. Yeah.
There's a range of different outcomes. I mean, the carbon credit market could be worth zero. You know, if everyone decides they want a carbon tax, then all of our markets are worth zero, right? Cap and trade goes out the door. If more people want cap and trade, then there's less need for. I mean, the best answer would be a global cap and trade, and then there's no need for a carbon credit market. Now, realistically, carbon credits are going to have to be. If you believe in using markets to help sort of balance the carbon cycle, and I believe in that, and valuing externalities. If you value the externalities of the negative of CO2 in and the positive of CO2 out, then you can solve for the atmosphere, right? These tools exist. So if we want to use these economic tools, then carbon credits should be part of the solution because you're not going to get a global cap and trade. And so they should be, I hope they are, but again, without the demand, without companies treating their emissions as liabilities, the carbon credit market is not going to scale. So that's a big question mark.
And just to add to you, I mean, I agree. The best thing would be global ETS. Probably we won't have that for many years. But still, if you just look at that system, you will, in the end, you're going to have zero allowances, but you're probably going to have some residual emissions still. So you need the credit market. You need the removals market to net it out. I'm sure it's going to be included in the mandatory market within not too distant.
Yeah, the tons basically swap out, right?
Yeah.
If you have a net zero pathway and that's your residual emissions, the abatement, the business as usual to your pathway, those are it's energy without emissions, so a renewable energy certificate. So if one of the easiest ways or the best ways to decarbonize is green electricity. So you're swapping a ton of electricity from gas or coal for a REC. Now they're both environmental too, so we need environmental markets. We're just sort of swapping them out as we transition, and again, these are used to basically balance the atmosphere. We get into a situation now where there's almost a new definition of greenwashing every week. And there was an example of a company in the UK recently that said that using renewable energy certificates was greenwashing. And you sort of go, so you're going to solve for decarbonization by not buying the REC, which is the only way to prove that you produced and consumed renewable electricity. So you're going to serve me brown power. That cannot be greenwashing. So the whole greenwashing term is dangerous as well. You need to be precise in the narrative. The educational component is key. If you're not precise in the narrative, then we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of using market-based mechanisms.
Yeah, I think this is, with rare exceptions, one of humanity's biggest challenges. And so you need the carbon tax, you need carbon markets, you need avoidance credits because they give you time, you need removal credits because they are the only way we're going to reach our goals. You need absolutely every single weapon that we have in our arsenal in order to get to that spot, right? So a combination. I'm all for carbon taxes. I'm all for, carbon markets. You need literally everything, and you're still coming up short. Renewable energy credits. Even though I'm in this space, an entrepreneur, so by definition optimistic. This 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, we are going to blow through that like you would not believe, right? I've been to COPs since COP 7, not to every one, thankfully. And I tell you, you have 196 countries trying to get to a decision, and every country has the same vote, right? In Cancun, Bolivia, right, which accounts for basically nothing in terms of climate change, was stopping the entire agreement that was trying to be cobbled together. One country, because they have one vote, same as any other country. So but we also need them, right? We also need all of the Council of Parties to move things forward. So it's a really interesting time, and it's going to attract a lot of dollars in every single direction, and they're all welcome.
Thomas.
Just to add to that, I think you perfectly, you're right in what you say, and I think the policymakers, the governments, the COPs, that's going to take time. It has taken a lot of time. So that's why the VCM market still has a really good important role to play, because that's like dragging the private sectors to a certain extent, dragging the part of the community forward. And then what you also said in terms of the different types of measures. Yes, we need everything, and if we just can agree on being clear on how to use them and the target and the target setting, so you diffuse the debate over the different tools, I think that would be so beneficial. And hopefully these global initiatives with the VCMI, or what is it, all the acronyms, Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity.
Don't get me started on these guys.
To clarify that would be very beneficial, I think.
So as we're wrapping the discussion, I think let's speculate to the future. That's probably the toughest one to do in this market, given that it's so undefined. But I have probably three ideas that I would like to hear your perspective. Since the couple of years back, I think BNF put the big elephant in the room. VCM goes to 50 billion. Everyone took that number and kind of went to play along with it, Whether that's right or not, we'll figure it out. So first question, do you think that's even a number feasible or not? Second question, I would like to give you a perspective, especially Bill, you mentioned that, from a COP perspective. Sovereign carbon markets, do they exist? There are countries, like if we use narrative oil, Saudi, like some other countries in Middle East, they became rich from having that commodity. Equally nature-based assets. Some of the countries that are not particularly the obvious ones could become significant parts of their GDP if they decide to close the market for themselves as a countries, nationalize the carbon markets, and issue that. We have certain countries in Africa where Shell owned assets and said, actually, you can't issue carbon credits because it's our land, so we own the credits. There was this discussion, I think, in one of the African countries. So sovereign markets, do they have a place? Could some countries, for example, in Africa, they could go out of some parts of poverty just because they have this natural resource and asset, like a sponge for capturing that carbon? That's my second question once you're taking that. And lastly, do you think it's evolution or it's revolution? And I'm sure as a market, because a lot of people, especially the new tech entrepreneurs, come and they're trying to go, this is the revolution, we're changing everything. And I think in this group, I would guess that you probably say this is an evolution of the market. So curious to have your take on each of these three subjects.
You want me to start?
Yeah.
In terms of future, if it's evolution or revolution, we know exactly where this market's going to go, right? When people sort of ask what's going to happen, et cetera, carbon, look at any commodity, right? And that's where carbon's going to be. So right now we're in, it's as I said earlier, a dog's breakfast, but we're just going to move into a place where things are commoditized, and carbon is going to be a portion of every single human interaction. So I think that 50 billion number is actually too small. I honestly believe that carbon is going to be part of every single transaction on Earth, and this is going to be a massive, massive market. If you look at the European Emission Trading Scheme when it first came out, the EU established that certain carbon credits were eligible for payment under the EU ETS liabilities, right? There was not a moment's missed where all of these, I believe there were 14,000 or so installations in Europe that were covered under this, under the EU ETS when it started. There was not a single one that started asking, well, what's the quality of these carbon credits, right? Not a single one, because the government had already determined these carbon credits you can use to pay your tax. They got on a plane, they went overseas, and they bought these carbon credits, right? And they delivered them, and the market was as traditional and as normal as possible. So I think that's, you know, in terms of the future, that's where we're going. In terms of size, that's honestly what I believe. I don't think that that this is a very small market in the least.
Thomas?
Is it evolutionary or revolutionary? I think it's going to be evolution now when we work on this. It's going to take time. It's going to be different paths. It's going to evolve over time. When we look back, and as you said, then we're going to realize it is a revolution, because it's a whole mindset shift. And as you said, carbon's going to go into every single transaction. But for us here, I think it's going to feel like an evolution, a long journey to move ahead. In terms of the size of the market, ooh, that's a tricky question. I pass. But it must be big. I mean, it's just look at once again, look at what we need to remove from the atmosphere in order to reach net zero, and put $100 on that. That's a massive market. Only that.
And sovereigns, does Nasdaq approach to run a single market? And for example, I know India had some ideas.
No, I think
Indonesia.
I think we're going to have there's going to be for a long time. It's going to grow up and develop regional markets with the sovereign markets, and where you handle the carbon credits into those schemes in parallel with the global market as well. I think it's inevitable.
Before we jump to Gordon, I just, exactly on that, I mean, I honestly believe that an unintended consequence of the Paris Accords is that every country in the world has sort of opened up to the underlying value of carbon, and that it is a national asset. So what we're seeing globally is that every country wants to have their own carbon exchange. Now, I know that sounds very strange, right, that they have a carbon exchange, but if you think about, like Indonesia, if you have a forestry project in Indonesia, until very recently, you and I could go there, buy the land, save the land, get it registered in Washington, sell it to a German company, and Indonesians would not know anything about it, right? So now they've legislated that that first trade has to happen in their country, right? So what's happening is that every single country is becoming its own carbon market, and that is central to our strategy, right? So by the end of the year, we will have 7 carbon markets in 7 different jurisdictions.
You already operate in Brazil, right?
We are in Brazil, Abu Dhabi, and Singapore. We'll be in an additional 4, and they'll start being announced over the next 2 months or so.
Congrats.
And all of them share the common order book. So it is one exchange, but it's a distributed exchange model. And the thought is that, you know, carbon is a national asset.
This is pretty fascinating, by the way.
Just
Sorry, guys, carry on.
Sorry, Gordon.
Go to Gordon.
Sorry.
Yeah, let's go to Gordon.
No, just one very short question, comment in terms of the assets in the countries. Just in the Nordics, we have fantastic possibilities for BECCS, for instance. You have like 20 million tons, 30 million tons just in Sweden, Finland to create permanent net negative emissions. And I think you're going to have these different possibilities around the globe, and actually can create a new industry of this. that you can export these kind of net negative emissions.
I mean, sovereign carbon is no different than sovereign extractive industry. So you have national oil companies, national energy companies. So you can have national carbon companies. It doesn't mean that you don't have partners that are external to government helping build those. Ultimately, they want to raise capital. You don't need to have a carbon exchange to raise capital. You can issue your credits, right? I think people go, what's the most successful carbon market in the world? It's the ETS. Oh, look, it's got a carbon exchange. So I need a carbon exchange to have the most... That's at the end, right? There's so much things that happen before that. Size, 50 billion. If you think that the carbon allowance market is already $1 trillion and it covers maybe 4 gigatons, if you're not going to get a global cap and trade, then 50 billion is small, but again, it could be zero. So it's definitely an evolution. Net zero is predominantly an energy transition. That's infrastructure. I don't think you can have a revolution in infrastructure. That's going to take time to basically lay the pipes and the networks to deliver joules in a different way than we've become accustomed to.
Amazing, gentlemen. Thanks a lot, Bill, Thomas, Gordon. A round of applause.
Thank you.